How do we discuss slashers? This seems like a basic leading question, but it's something that's been on my mind for the better part of 2 years. Today we're going to answer this question and get to the root of why I've become enamored with a specific film. It's a film you probably know a little bit from pop culture osmosis alone. To understand why I chose this film as a template for this discussion requires a lot of history. Sorry, you'll thank me later, maybe. Part 1. History of the Slasher. So, we don't have time to go through the mess that is the Hays Code right now, but in brief, it was rules for censorship created by Hollywood in response to pressure about lewd content in films, and controversies relating to stars. While there's definitely still influence to be read into pre-Hays Code horror films, and films made in the middle of it, relevant to our purposes is 1960's Psycho. Psycho was a widely successful film which, along with many other films of the time, helped lay groundwork towards the Hays Code's eventual destruction due to being allowed to depict violence and sexuality that was formerly restricted. It also helped establish a now common practice of viewing films, that is, all in one go, due to marketing practices that protected the film's central twist from being revealed to lategoers. While the influential Les Diaboliques did a similar thing before it, a mainstream American film doing this is arguably unprecedented. The universal success of Psycho created a lot of buzz, which led to a lot of derivative works. To summate relevant examples, Dementia 13, one of Francis Ford Coppola's first features, uses a gothic aesthetic in a castle, with a plot revolving around people being murdered one by one. William Castle's Homicidal, while being annoyingly gimmicky,
"This is the Fright Break,"
was also a mainstream film that didn't edit out its gore during the Hays Code era. The Spanish film The House That Screamed, having strong thematic similarities to Psycho, used a campus setting with a killer plot, far before the 80s boom of that sort of idea. This impact in turn is reflected in other subgenres under the exploitation umbrella. Splatter films, movies focused primarily on displaying gore, were highly profitable during this era due to how cheap they were to make. 1963's Blood Feast alone received an estimated $4 million on less than $25,000 in budget, and the success of these early works allowed for later films, including Night of the Living Dead, to have an audience. Also worth noting, Italian giallo films often use structures and tropes you most commonly associate with later films. Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace was very forward in its focus on murder and sex, and heavily inspired not only the rest of the giallo subgenre, but filmmakers who became influential in their own right, such as David Argento and Martin Scorsese. Additionally, Bava's 1971 work A Bay of Blood, or whatever one of its absurdly many titles you want to use, helped popularize the common structure of slasher films and the common narrative framework of person do a stab. In addition to the aesthetic of outdoor settings getting utilization in Friday the 13th, The Burning, Just Before Dawn, etc. 1973's Torso, or Il Corpi Presentando Tresse di Violenza Carnale, failed that one, has a masked killer seeking revenge for a past incident that affected them personally, and even had a final girl sequence. To round out our little history lesson, the influence of The Exorcist and other massive horror successes would eventually result in John Carpenter getting creative control to create Halloween, whose influence would kick off a trend throughout the 80s that would solidify our current definition of the label slasher film, and yes, would directly inspire Friday the 13th. Now, a lot of analysis has been put towards deconstructing the subtextual implications of this type of narrative, and whether it ultimately reinforces puritanical morality by having anyone sexually active be killed and reveling in the gore related to that, or if it subverts this type of reading by always framing the person committing these actions as a villain, who is ultimately defeated by a far more innocent heroine. This discussion is obviously not new at all. If you know anything about slashers, odds are you've heard this debate countless times and are sick of it. However, this framework is very important in regards to understanding why many critics have trouble assessing genre fare with equal amounts of curiosity. Halloween was, and still is, an impactful film that is very easy to use as framework. After all, it has standout performances, the music and cinematography are beautifully rendered, the plot clicks along at a steady pace, and it leaves off on an ambiguous ending that begs for evaluation of what happened. But why is it when a film has qualities that are harder to accept, it's treated very differently? Take this list of positive qualities I just described, and then don't proceed to do many of these to the same expected degree. Does this mean what is created is now not worthy of fair analysis? Well, that's kinda where we're at when we talk about lower-rung slasher films. Audiences tend to appreciate the nuances of the genre. In fact, it's why they've always been rather profitable in certain films to manage to avoid completely fading away. A more positive example of this meta-context can be found with Matt Hills' essay on Para-Cinema. When discussing Jeffrey Scones' 1993 essay Spectacles of Death, Hills has this to say. Scones relates the cultural devaluation of certain horror films to the opposition between appeals to issues of originality, character, and realism, where these are dicursively positioned and valued over formula, sensationalism, and special effects. Such oppositions have certainly worked to devalue certain slasher movies intensely, while other slashers have been recontextualized as historically significant film art within academic and critical circles. This self-conscious historicization of 1980 slasher movies has provoked and sustained a range of situated shifts in the slasher flick's cultural value. It has allowed contemporary fans of the Friday the 13th franchise to dicursively locate themselves outside the mainstream by contrasting their enduring love of Friday the 13th films with the sheer commercial success of early films in the franchise, making this more of a cult fandom. It has also allowed Friday the 13th to be devalued and othered academically via a historical contrast between this film and Halloween, director John Carpenter, 1978. Looking at other critiques of Friday the 13th, this contrast of value is very true. Take how Siskel and Ebert discussed this back in 1980, for instance.
Okay, that's Halloween, a horror movie we both think is pretty good.
Very good. Yeah.
One of the things a short scene can't show you is that Halloween is directed and acted with a great deal more artistry and craftsmanship than the sleaze bucket movies we've been talking about. But there's another much more important difference. As you watch Halloween, your basic sympathies are always enlisted on the side of the woman, not with the killer. The movie develops its women characters as independent, intelligent, spunky, and interesting people. Halloween does not hate women.
Yeah, you know, when I saw that scene, I must admit I wasn't really worrying about the woman as much as I was placing myself in that closet and thinking about that killer, how I would handle it. And I was also appreciating the fact that I think Halloween not only doesn't hate women, but it loves film and filmmaking. That music is just fabulous. The way he starts one theme, then lays another thing on top of it, keeping the other theme. Really good. Also, the light coming through the slats in that closet. This is a film that's sort of up. That scene is up, and you're jumpy, rather than getting depressed and feeling sorry and feeling sorry that you're even watching it. An upbeat thing.
Halloween is good because it displays artistry and puts your sympathies towards the victims, unlike all these other films which don't. To explain why I don't agree with this, let's go through Friday the 13th and discuss what is implicated by its narrative. Part 2, The Present, 1979. The first aspect, and probably the one most people are quick to dislike, including past me, is how the film is paced. Oftentimes, the film will linger on specific shots for longer than appears necessary, which is something by the time its sequel came out was standardized. Take this bit here, where Annie is first walking into town. In terms of structure, this scene comes after a good 6 minutes of establishing dread over the killer. Instead of breezing through this section to start establishing more people to be murdered, it takes time to allow for contemplation of the setting in a way I think is rare. This also helps establish the film's unrefined style. The camera, despite having very clear framing, is oftentimes quite janky when following movement, best shown here when Annie's being driven closer to Camp Crystal Lake. I think this fits the setting of Outdoors America to have things framed this way, making the movie feel rather lived in, while at the same time separating the audience from the familiar. For contrast, when you watch Halloween, you're always subtly reminded that you're watching a story. Thanks to the Steadicam, we're always smoothly transitioning from one point to another. And due to Loomis's parallel storyline, we always have a bedrock towards understanding what Michael is and what's being done to stop him. Thus, when Loomis shows up at the end to save Laurie, it feels like everything comes together.
What's the boogeyman?
As a matter of fact, it was.
I think this is great structuring, don't get me wrong, but I also think there's value to the sort of unstructured chaos Friday the 13th starts to get up to. Since many of the characters are only at the camp, for long stretches of time there's no authority figure to defer back to. This is partly why Annie being killed is shocking, as she's the only character until the ending who is told really important information about Camp Crystal Lake and the tragedies relating to it. This leaves only biased parties to interact with the group from then on, including
I'm a messenger of God.
Ralph's interesting because of how he contrasts with the others. As Annie points out when talking to Enos, what they convey is ultimately the same stigma that Camp Crystal Lake is jinxed.
Oh, terrific. Not you too. You sound like your crazy friend back there, Ralph.
Well, maybe.
You get these people warning the counselors about the dangers of Crystal Lake, but just warnings. There's no sign that they'll be helpful if another tragedy were to happen, they just warn and ride away on their bikes. Contrast this with the communal aspects of the counselors, who are rather resourceful when together. Take the scene where Ned pretends to drown, for example. They all immediately rush into action to save him, with the killer watching them from afar. When there's a snake in one of the dorms, everyone is involved trying to help in perhaps an overreactive manner.
I'll flush it out!
There's even some setup with how they handle the emergency generator, which becomes extremely important later in the film. We're shown that despite the tropes of the genre, these people are independent and, under the demands of the camp, for the most part know what they're doing. Also worth noting, the usage of different camera perspectives to convey either objective or subjective viewpoints is present here, and is used rather effectively to keep you guessing on how scenes play out. Take the scene where we're viewing Marcy and Jack from what appears to be a voyeuristic perspective. As was set up with the pool scene, we expect some form of the killer to be revealed when the camera starts panning back, but this isn't the case. Instead, we see that we're viewing their interactions from Ned's perspective, thus making the scene go from creating tension to developing characters, and then back to creating tension and using that camera perspective again once the killer does show up. Nowadays, this sort of visual setup and payoff tends to result in a fake jump scare of the sort. But here, the almost casual use of this language is rather surprising. It makes the early parts of the film a lot easier to watch, knowing that you aren't going to get arbitrarily surprised by something that doesn't matter. Last little bit, I find this moment where Marcy talks about her dreams to be interesting and kinda tragic.
The rain turns to blood. And the blood washes away in little rivers. And then the sound stops.
Like many slashers, this omen eventually results in just one person being alive, who has to figure out a situation they are entirely sure the severity of. This is represented pretty well in the scene where Alice makes coffee while waiting for Bill to return from fixing the generator. I used to hate this scene because it slows down the plot for more tension building, but I think what I missed was the subtleties of it. As you can see, Alice is only making 2 cups of coffee. In a subconscious way, she's accepted that everyone except Bill is gone. The drama of the scene is ultimately her having to decide whether to believe Bill's reassurance that it all could be explained easily, or that something is terribly wrong. Once she makes her decision, the film asserts the horror she's about to discover by having her be surrounded by darkness. The status quo that was established earlier in the film is permanently upended. Any help from authority that could come has been removed, leaving her to scramble in the dark. This makes the scene where Alice is trying to barricade the door rather effective as well. Despite her skills as a counselor, she doesn't know what she's doing, and as if to reinforce it, the killer taunts her as she comes to that thought.
What am I gonna do?
Seeing another of her friends dead, her emotional breakdown comes to a head, and just then a car arrives. Alice runs out of the cabin, and it's revealed that the killer is actually
Jason! Jason! Jason!
I'm sorry. That's the wrong answer.
No, it's not! No, it's not! It was Jason!
Afraid not. No way.
Listen, it was Jason! I saw that movie 20 goddamn times!
Then you should know Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, was the original killer.
In terms of impact, I would say this twist is the aspect that has gotten progressively better as the series goes on. Pop culture reinforces this is a series about Jason, yet in the first feature, it's not exactly. The fact that Mrs. Voorhees despises teen sexuality is directly tied to her guilt towards not being there when Jason needed her.
Jason should have been watched every minute. He wasn't a very good swimmer. Look what you did to him. Look what you did to him!
This in turn makes the deaths in the film symbolic, as Mrs. Voorhees is taking her anger out on a concept she can fully understand, the stereotypical irresponsible teens. Let's look at the scene where Ned pretends to drown again. As I mentioned, the killer, Mrs. Voorhees, is watching them save Ned. Maybe seeing Ned make a mockery of that form of death just confirmed what she already believes, that these kids, and by extension society at large, doesn't care what she's suffered. With this framing, the film can be interpreted as a revenge film between teens who really did nothing wrong and a woman who thinks they're the reason her son isn't alive. It's an uncomfortable sort of understanding that villains like Michael never reached. Mrs. Voorhees is both sympathetic and monstrous, a fine balance to walk, but one I think is pulled off rather effectively. Ultimately though, despite this nuance, we're still rooting for Alice to make it out alive. The final sequence is devoted to a somewhat familiar cat and mouse game where Alice tries to defend herself against Mrs. Voorhees. It gets a little silly how many times Alice knocks her down, but eventually it results in her getting Mrs. Voorhees' machete and decapitating her, the frame rate slowing down as if to communicate what's happening isn't real. With her nightmare over, Alice gets on a canoe and waits for help. The music turns ethereal, upbeat almost. She did it. She's free. I think what's very interesting about this last scene of Alice is, once again, the framing. Unlike Carrie, whose jump scare ultimately implies the PTSD and trauma Sue will now have to live with forever, this jump scare seems to reiterate a point.
Then he's still there.
His name was Jason, and he's still in the lake. They never recovered his body. Nobody cared to. Part 3, Retrospect. Let's go back to that Siskel and Ebert clip. Part of why I find this special and many other critiques of Friday the 13th and other slashers so frustrating is the lack of curiosity towards discussing the text beyond generalities. Often it's noted the utilization of aesthetic choices from former works, but not much is dug into in this regard other than saying the work is derivative. Friday the 13th in particular is considered a derivative film, using and recontextualizing aspects from works such as The Bay of Blood, Psycho, Carrie, and of course Halloween. Using this as a criticism is something I find somewhat funny, because when looking at Halloween, a film continually put above other films of the genre, you can see how it was also influenced by earlier works. In fact, some early reviews of the film were even critical of this, such as this original Evening Sun review from 1978, which says, "Halloween is a tediously familiar thing produced by Deborah Hill and directed by John Carpenter, who probably thinks he is paying homage to Alfred Hitchcock by imitating the director's style. He makes the movies done by the master of suspense look like art. There is a lot of heavy breathing in Halloween. There is also a lot of wasted time. I have never known a film that took so long to dispense with 3 victims." There's also that infamous Kale quote, which goes as follows: "Maybe when a horror film is stripped of everything but dumb scariness, when it isn't ashamed to revive the stalest device of the genre, the escaped lunatic, it satisfies part of the audience in a more basic, childish way than sophisticated horror pictures do." Now, I show these reviews to present my point. How we perceive art is commonly cultivated by consensus over time. When Halloween is first released, its influences from former works was obvious, but now retrospectively, this is rarely discussed. Siskel and Ebert criticizing derivative slashers puts their critiques in the same mindset as those early Halloween reviews, and more recently, the often refuted post-horror article is heavily rooted in the same mindset as Kale. All of these critiques is trying to explain why they resonate with certain media and not others by compartmentalizing what they like into a distinct and separate category. But this isn't really possible, or at least it doesn't give you a complete picture. As I showed earlier, slasher films owe most of their influence and popularity from a variety of earlier subgenres, with many of the films there not receiving critical re-evaluation until later. Blood and Black Lace received mixed reviews when it was released. A Bay of Blood is still a film that is mixed in reception. That doesn't mean they're not valuable pieces of art, but it does indicate there is a lot to discuss with what they're saying by using a cat and mouse structure, often resulting in extreme violence and gore. Now, Friday the 13th by contrast with today's works and earlier films is pretty tame. Arguing this film is empty due to focusing on extended sequences of build-up leading to violence, as Mr. Siskel argued in his original 1980 review, is not something I can really get behind. There's readable complexity to both these sequences and the thematic messaging. I think Friday the 13th is a pretty good film. You don't have to agree with me on that, but hopefully you understand how I feel about the way it's commonly discussed. Art isn't always a perfectly structured thing that'll become a hit immediately, and it's fine if you still don't resonate with it. Friday the 13th is just one of many films that is allowed to exist due to how earlier works push boundaries and popularize the conventions it utilizes, and I think that's enough to justify its existence.